Hello everyone and welcome to another Fusion 360 Tech Tuesday. Today's topic is going to be all about the construction menu. So we're going to learn about construction planes and construction axes and construction points. So let's dive right in. So I'm going to be talking about this menu right here. And you'll notice there's actually quite a few options in here. So I'm going to walk through a majority of these and then show you, for example, a real-world example on how you might be able to solve that. Now, construction planes are quite useful for creating sketches that are in an interesting location. And what I mean by that is typically, if I wanted to draw a sketch on this face, I could select that face and say Create Sketch. But what if I wanted, for example, to drill a hole for maybe like a set screw at a particular angle on this cylinder? And that's where these construction planes really come into play. So I'm going to walk through each of these. So the very first one is offset plane. And what this basically allows you to do is to specify a plane and then specify a distance. So for example, let's say I want to create a tab or something like that on this wall right here that's down a certain distance. Well, I could come in here and just click on this face, start to drag, and let's just say maybe we want to go -8 millimeters in this case. When I say OK, you'll see that it created an offset plane from this top face down 8 millimeters. And what's cool about this is I can now, for example, create a sketch. I could draw my particular shape that I want. Let's just say maybe it's something like this. And again, I'm not going to worry about dimensions per se, just to kind of speed things up. But now I can create a sketch like this and extrude that. And it's already in the correct location where it needs to be. Okay, so I came down 8 millimeters using the offset plane. Now here's another example of where offset planes really come into play. And I'm going to come back to this model a couple times here, but you can see that I have a large cylinder and a small cylinder. And I want this small cylinder to intersect. You can kind of see it's like a hollow tube or whatever. So I'm going to start by just creating a cylinder. And let's just make it, 50 in diameter. And I'll just make it 100 tall, for example. Okay. Now I want to create that circle. Okay. To do that, I'm going to use a tangent plane. Okay. Now there's many different ways we could do this, but I'm going to show you. I'm going to use the tangent plane. So I'm going to say tangent plane, and I'm going to go ahead and click on a face. Okay. Now what it's going to do is create a plane that's tangent to that cylinder. And I can specify an angle. I'll come back to that later. I'm going to just leave it 0 for now. And I'm going to just say OK. And I now have a plane on that cylinder, which I can sketch on. So I'm going to go ahead and create a sketch. I'll draw my circle. I'll just make it 25 in this case. And stop my sketch. Now here you're going to see an interesting issue. This circle is sitting right on that cylinder. So when I go to extrude this a certain distance, let's just say 15, it's going to leave a little bit of a lip back here because it's not wrapping around this cylinder. Okay. Well, then I could say, well, maybe let's go 2 sides. And I could start to drag this way, and now you can kind of see it's going to cut into that cylinder. So I would have to say join, and it's basically going to fix that area. But that's kind of weird, right? So let's try that again. I'll come in here and I'll say extrude. Okay. So there's an option here that says to object. So I'm going to say to this object, but again you'll notice I get a weird result. It's trying to go to the back side and it says 0 distance because it's already sitting tangent to that face. So here's where your offset plane kind of comes into play. I'm going to undo back a little bit. I created my tangent plane. Then I'm going to come in and do an offset plane. And I want that cylinder to be 15 millimeters, so I'll say 15, from the larger cylinder. So you can kind of see it's basically going to offset this plane 15 millimeters. Then I can sketch on this guy. I'll say create sketch. We'll do the circle, 20. And now when I come in here and say extrude, I can actually say to object. Click on my cylinder and you can see that it's actually going to extend all the way around that curved surface. So I'll say OK. And you'll notice that it created some construction planes. I'm going to go ahead and expand that open. And we can see there's my first plane that I did. And then here's the second one that I did. Okay, and I can toggle them on and off by just hitting the little light bulb icon. So that's where this offset plane can really come in handy, is to basically go a certain distance from an existing face or an existing plane. Okay, so that's offset plane. The next one that I use quite often is plane at an angle. So I'm going to go ahead and click on plane at an angle. And you'll notice that it's saying line, okay? So it's asking me to specify a particular line. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this guy here. And you'll see that it created a plane that's going along that line. But now I can specify an angle. And I can either drag my little drag guy here, for example, to 45. Or I can type something in, for example, 15. And this is going to allow me to create a plane at a very particular angle. Now this is important because if you're wanting to do, like a set screw or something like that, that goes in at, at a very particular angle. So for example, maybe over on this side here, I'll come in here and say plane at an angle. I'll click on a line like so. And I want it to be 45. So I'm going to say 45. I can now sketch on that plane, and you'll see how it kind of projects my 3D model because we're sitting at kind of a 45-degree angle right now. I can come in, specify the size of the set screw, let's just say 4 in this case, and extrude that through. Okay. Kind of a weird place to put a set screw, but I was just kind of trying to show you the idea how you can put a plane at a very specific angle. Okay, and we're going to come back to that one also with that cylinder example that I was talking about. I've already shown tangent plane, but I'm going to show it on this example here. I'll say tangent plane, and what's the face? Now this is kind of interesting. Watch what happens. I'm going to go ahead and click right about here, okay? And you'll notice as I rotate, it basically put the plane tangent to that cylinder where I clicked, okay? So let me do that again. I'm going to click a little bit higher up this time, and notice the angle of the plane. So the plane is tangent to the cylinder where you click. Now, where you click could be anywhere in space. You have no idea. In fact, you'll notice it's saying that's at 0 degrees, when in reality it probably isn't. Okay, so there's a really neat option in here that not a lot of people realize, is we have this reference plane. So I can click on an existing plane. So for example, maybe this face here or this face here. It really doesn't matter. I'm just going to go ahead and select one of those. And now you can see that this plane is tangent to the cylinder and at 0 degrees to this top face. So if I were to type in 45, we'd see it go that direction. Let me go minus 45. And we can see now that we have a plane at a 45-degree angle, referencing that face there. I'll go ahead and hit OK. Here's another neat little tip. You'll notice that this plane is fairly small compared to some of the other planes, like this one here. Why is that one larger, for example, compared to this one here, which is even significantly larger? And it has to do with basically the ratio of the feature that you clicked on. So this line here was longer than, for example, this distance here. So that's why that plane was bigger. You can resize these just by getting near a corner. You'll see that it turns to a little dot. You can just click and drag those around. So I can make this any size that I want. Okay. So just because your plane shows up fairly small, you're not restricted to that. You can always just grab the corner and extend them out. So a neat little tip. Okay, mid-plane. I use this one a lot. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and turn off this other guy. I'll say mid-plane. This one's really useful. Maybe I want to create something that's in between, like these ribs or something like that. So I could come in here and say between that face and this face here. And you'll see that it created a plane in between those two faces. And just like I showed before, you can scale this down if you need to. But I now have a plane that's cutting through my part. And this is great if you want to mirror something, for example. So if I had, let me go ahead and turn this guy off. If I had, for example, a feature, let's just create a sketch on this face. So if I had created a circle or something like that, and then I'll extrude this. I'll say join. Okay. And I want that to be on the other side. Instead of having to recreate it, draw another sketch or whatever, I could do a mid-plane, then come in and say create a mirror. I'm going to say mirror a feature. We're going to mirror this extrude feature. What's the mirror plane? This middle plane right there. I'll say OK. And you can see how I've now mirrored that little button onto both sides using that mirror plane, or that mid plane, I should say. So I use mid plane a lot. Very, very, very useful. Some of these other ones, not used as much, but pretty powerful. So I'm going to walk through each of these. Plane through two edges. Okay, and it's going to create a plane that goes through two edges. So for example, I take a look at maybe this round area right here, and maybe I want to create some kind of an indentation or a slot or something like that. Well, I could say create a plane through that edge and a plane through that edge, and you'll see how it created that plane through those two edges. Now I could have used, tangent and specified an angle like I showed earlier, but this is a really quick way of basically creating a plane that goes through those two edges that I could now sketch on, for example. Okay. A plane through 3 points. So and you can see if I hover over it, it says can be construction points, sketch points, or vertices. So I'm going to say plane through 3 points. And let's just see if I could find 3 points that kind of makes sense here. I always have a hard time with this one. Let's try, well, yeah, I'll just do this. So I'm going to say, for example, this point here, and this point here. And I'm going to get a similar result to the two edges. You can see how I was able to select 3 points, and it created a plane that goes through those 3 points. Okay. So let me see if I can do something a little bit more interesting. Let's go maybe through this point here, and that point there, and you can see how it's creating a plane that goes through those 3 points. Again, like I mentioned, some of these I use more often than others, and you might be put into situations where you're like, man, how am I going to do this? And so I would try some of these other ones, such as playing through 2 edges or playing through 3 points. And you'll see, especially when we get into the axes, that we can use axes to help us define our planes. Okay. So plane tangent to a face at a point. Okay. So I'm going to flip around over here. I'll say plane tangent to a face at a point. Now here's the interesting thing. I can click a face. Okay. Now it says specify a point. But you'll notice that there's no points until I get to like a corner, like right here, for example. So I could click right there, and it's going to create a plane that's tangent to that blue face right at that point. If we take a kind of look at it from the top, you can kind of see that. Okay. So the key thing there is you do have to have a point that you could click. So a prime example is, I'm going to do this face here, but now I have no points except way over here, which really doesn't make any sense because obviously that's tangent going to that flat surface. So I would have to have a projected point or another sketch or something like that on here. Okay. So I don't use that one very often. Now, plane along a path I use a lot. This is a really cool tool. So I'm going to say plane along a path, and it's asking for a path, and you'll notice it says tangent chain. So watch what happens when I hover over this edge. You can see that it's going to select this curved edge, but then it's also going to select the straight edges that are tangent to it. So I'm just going to click somewhere on this edge, and it creates my plane. And you'll notice it says distance is 0.27. This is not the physical distance in like inches or millimeters. This is a ratio. So for example, if I go all the way back here, we can see it's a distance of 0. And if I drag this along, you'll see that it actually follows this path. So I can put this plane anywhere along this path. And if I go all the way to the end, we can see a distance of 1. So ratio of 0 to 1. So I could, for example, come in here and say 0.5. And obviously it's going to put it halfway along this path. You can also see when you drag that it creates some little reference points. So I could catch right there and it kind of snaps to it. I could come over here and it kind of snaps to that middle of the edge there. Or I can go all the way to the end. So check this out. Let's do it a little bit more complicated. I'm going to go ahead and pick on this edge. And notice it does the tangent chain all the way around. And I can put this path anywhere that I want. And you can see it's going to rotate as I drag it along, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so I'm going to move it all the way over here to about 50. Okay, we'll snap to 0.5. And I'm just going to say OK. So what's neat about this is I can come in and create a quick sketch and do maybe a complicated profile. So I'm just going to do maybe a rectangle like this and maybe a smaller rectangle like that. Okay. So I was able to sketch on this edge, and I can use that profile to do maybe like a sweep, for example. So we'll select our profiles, select our path, and you can see that it's going to use that path and that profile to sweep cut a complex shape. all the way along that path. And the key thing there is that you want your profile to be tangent to that edge, or to any of the edges. Okay? So that plane along a path is actually quite useful. Okay, I'm going to undo that for now. The next section you can see is broken into the axes. And we have multiple options here. Axes through cylinder, cone, or torus. Perpendicular at a point, through two planes, through two points. Pretty similar, what we see up here. Through an edge, and perpendicular to a face. So why would I need an axis? Well, in some of these situations, you need like a reference for your plane to sit on. So for example, if I wanted a plane to go through the center of this circle, I could probably use tangent plane. But see, that goes to the outside and not through the center, so that wouldn't work. Mid-plane, well, there's no two faces there. So if I want to put a plane right through the center here, I'm going to say axis through the cylinder. What's the face? I can pick either of these, it doesn't matter. And you'll see that it puts a little dashed line in there. And that's our axis right through the center. And just like with the planes, if I get near the edge, I can actually drag that axis to be taller or longer, whichever term you want to use. So you can see that I made that axis much larger just by dragging the endpoints. Okay. So I'm looking over at the chat really quick. Somebody asked a really good question. Why would you need to change the size of your plane? That's a really valid question. It's just personal preference. You know, and his comment is valid. You know, your sketches could go off the side of this. Absolutely, they could. But like if my plane was something like this, it might be kind of hard to see what's it doing. You know, where is it actually cutting through? And so I want to kind of see, okay, it's actually cutting through this edge and cutting through this edge over here. Does it matter if it's small or large? No. So, you know, thanks for asking that question. Again, it's just personal preference. Especially when you start working in the really tight areas and your planes are really small, I like to make them a little bit larger. In fact, thank you for asking this question, because I'm going to show you a neat example with the plane along a path. Watch what happens here. I'm going to say plane along a path, and I'm going to pick on this edge here, and you'll notice how, you know, the size of my construction plane is. Okay, I'm going to do the exact same thing, but I'm going to pick on just this little edge right here, and notice how tiny it is. I have to zoom way up to actually see that plane. And again, it's because it's basically a ratio of the size of the edge that you selected. So if I were to select this edge, you'll see that it's larger. If I were to select this edge, it'll be large, but if I were to select a small edge, it's going to be fairly tiny. In fact, almost impossible to see. However, I can just grab the corners and make those larger. So yeah, great question. Thanks for asking that. Okay. Okay, moving on here. So we were talking about axes. So now I have an axis through a cylinder. And check this out. I can now say plane at an angle. And it's asking for a line. Where before I was selecting, you know, edges and stuff like that, I can now come in and click this axis line. So I'm going to go ahead and select on it. You can see the size of the rectangle there. I can now specify what angle I want that plane to be at, whether it's 90 or 35 or whatever, but I now have a plane that's cutting through the center of that cylinder. Okay. Axis perpendicular at a point. Now again, at the point, unless I have a sketch, which I'll show here in just a second, but let's just go ahead and say this face here, I'm going to go ahead and click right there, and you'll notice that it created an axis perpendicular to that face at that particular point. Okay. Now, if I want to be more precise than that, I might have to do 2 steps, kind of like what I did with the axis and the angle plane. I'm going to put a plane on here and create a sketch and place a point. Okay. And I can put this point wherever I want, and I can dimension that point. So I could say, that this point is a certain distance from this top edge. Let's just make it 8 in this case. And I could also say it's a certain distance from this edge, and let's just make that 20. Okay, so I have a very specific point location. Now I could come in and say axis perpendicular at a point. So what's the face? That's the face. But you'll notice it put it where I clicked on it. Okay, so instead I'm going to come here and click on the point, and it puts it through the point. Okay, let me undo a couple steps there. The next one is axis through 2 planes. So this one's kind of interesting. I have this angled face here and this angled face over here. So watch what happens when I do this. I'm going to go ahead and click that face. I'm going to probe through so I don't have to rotate. I'm going to grab that face, and notice where the axis line appeared. Over here. Okay, so it's basically, it put the axis where those 2 planes intersect. And maybe for aesthetics reasons, we want to put something here and it kind of lines up with that angle. So this is kind of a useful tool for creating something that kind of slices through 2 planes. So again, I could say here, and it's going to create an axis out here, which I could then use to reference. Okay. And I'll shorten that guy up because it doesn't need to be quite so big. There we go. Axis through 2 points. I don't use this one as often, but it kind of comes in handy. And again, I'll just show you an example here. I could say I want to go an axis between that point and this point here, and you'll see it just basically connects the 2 dots with an axis that I could then, for example, revolve around or something. Okay, so you basically specify 2 points, and it creates an axis through there. Okay. See if I can do another example here. Just for example, something like this. Don't know why you would do that, but you can kind of get the idea where you can see it's going through the 2 points. Okay, axis through an edge. Pretty much the exact same thing that what it says. I could say, for example, let's just click this edge here, and it just puts an axis through that edge. Again, I don't use this one all that often because I can just say rotate around an edge, but it does allow you to, specify an axis on any edge if need be. Okay. And then axis perpendicular to face. So this one's kind of useful. So again, I'll pick one of these cylindrical faces. I'm just going to click somewhere, and you'll notice it says specify a point. So I don't have a point, but if I click up here, for example, it's going to create an axis tangent to that face, or perpendicular, I should say, to that face at a particular point. Okay. So let's try, for example, this curved face here. And what's the point? Now here's an interesting thing that you can do. I click this face, but I'm actually going to click a point across the part, and you'll see that it's creating an axis that goes perpendicular to this face, pointing to that point back there. So that might be where I want to, put a hole or something like that, for example. I could do the same thing over here. I'll click somewhere on this face, over here to the left a little bit, and then what's the point that I want to catch to? Maybe I'll just say like right here, and you can see how it created the axis perpendicular to that face, kind of through the center of the part. Okay. Then we have points, and sometimes these are useful. So points at vertex, a point through two edges, point through three planes, point at the center of a circle, and a point at an edge and a plane. So let's just take a look at any of these. I'm going to say point at vertex. Now, again, I don't use some of these very often, but I can go ahead and click right there, and that just creates a point that I can reference, okay? And I noticed, I think somebody was asking a question about, do these points, can they be used as references for additional planes and axes? Absolutely. So by putting a point there, I can then come in and say, for example, axis perpendicular at point, and select a face. Well, I guess that one doesn't let me do it because it does it just right where I click, which is unfortunate. But the other ones where it's like tangent to a face at a point, that kind of a thing, you can. Okay. Axis perpendicular at point. No, let me do the other one. Perpendicular to a face and a point. So I'll say that guy at that point, and then it'll cut through. So I don't use point at vertex very often because pretty much every endpoint has a vertex. But some of these other ones are quite useful. Point through two edges. Okay, so I can specify two edges. So I'll say, for example, that edge there. And you'll notice it's not letting me pick another vertical edge, but it's allowing me to pick like a horizontal edge. Or even down, no, I guess just this on this same surface here. And it created a point, it's kind of hard to see, at this intersection right there. Okay. Let me try a couple, let's see. Trying to find something that would make more sense. Let's do point, let me try point through two edges. Let's try that edge there and that edge there. And you can see that it created a point out here. So again, pretend that this axis wasn't there. Let me get rid of that. I'll say point through two edges. So we're basically extending these two edges, and now there's a point there that I can reference, that I can use for doing an axis, or maybe putting, for example, plane at an angle or something like that. I could go through there. Point through three planes. Okay, so I'm going to say point through three planes. And let's say, for example, this plane here, this plane here, and then it's asking for a third plane. So I'm going to go ahead and select this plane here and see where it put the point. So that point is basically an extension of that face. It's an extension of this face, and it's sitting on that blue face. So a great way to reference something to get, figure out where these converge on a particular surface. So that was a point through three planes. Okay, then we have a point at a center of a circle, a sphere, or a torus. So I can select any of these, circular edges. They can even be, half circles or whatever. It doesn't have to be a full circle. So you can kind of see how it's creating the points at the center of these circles and arcs. Okay. And then finally, point at an edge and a plane. So it's asking for a line and a plane. So let's go ahead and do something, for example, like I'll say this line here, and let's just say maybe this plane right there. And you can see how it created a point that extended up along this line onto that plane. Okay, so let me do that again. I'll say, for example, this line, what plane? I'm going to click way over here to the left, and notice it puts the point way over here. So it's basically just extending that line up onto this plane. So that one's kind of useful. Okay, so I just kind of went through the menu really quick and showed you each of those kind of at a high level. And now I'm going to show kind of a real world example where I need to create that cylindrical pipe with a 90-degree angle, and then I want something at a slightly different angle. And that can be somewhat difficult to do. But using these construction planes, it should be fairly quick and easy. Okay, so I showed in this example where we used a tangent plane, and then we created an offset plane from that tangent plane. Okay, so I'm going to undo. Let's just walk through that again now that you kind of know the whole process of what we're doing there. So I just started with a cylinder, and I want to create that little boss that stands off of it. So I'm going to come in here and say tangent plane, and I'll click on that face. Now if I turn on my origin, you'll see that I'm at some weird angle, okay, because I just randomly clicked on that face. So if I wanted to, I could come in and say reference plane and select one of these planes. And now I know that I'm actually looking at my front plane. I can kind of see that here and there. And we're basically at 0 degrees. I could say I want to come 45 degrees from that. So I'm going to say 45 in this case. So I'm no longer lined up with my origin. Okay. Kind of handy. Then I'm going to do an offset plane. Start to drag. And let's just do 15 in this case. And I'll sketch on that face. I'm just going to hover over the 0, 0 here, and let's just move straight up a little bit and make that 20 in this case. So I can select my profile, say extrude, and when I showed earlier, instead of just dragging like this, which would work if I said join, but I like to show some of the other options in here, okay, where I could say to object. What's the object? That guy. And you see that it's going to extrude to that object. And you even have some cool options in here, such as, you know, offsetting it. Let's just say offsetting at 5 millimeters. And you can see that it's actually going to extrude to that face, but then come back 5 millimeters. And notice the shape that we get. Okay, so some cool options. I'm going to say extrude to the object. I'll say OK. And I'll turn off that construction plane. I don't need it anymore. Okay, in this next example, I want to create kind of the same shape, but at an angle. Okay, so using what we've learned, I could say plane at an angle. Okay, but it's asking for a line. And none of these that I'm hovering over are lines. I could hover over one of these guys, for example, this axis, and it will let me do it, but it's in the wrong location. I don't want it there, and it's in the wrong direction of all things. So, unfortunately, plane at an angle isn't going to work for me. in this case. But neither would any of these other ones. So we're actually going to have to create a line for the plane at an angle. So for example, I could come in here, turn on this plane, create a sketch, and I'm just going to use the line tool. I'll come down a little bit, maybe somewhere like so, and in fact I'll just go like that. We can see there's my line. Now I don't need it to be an actual real object line, so I'm going to click on it and say make that a construction line. And you can see that it's just basically a like a pencil line, for example. And I'll say stop my sketch. Now I can come in here and say plane at an angle. Sorry, I gave it away. The line was already selected, so let me do that again. I'll say plane at an angle. Now it's going to ask for the line. So I'm going to go ahead and select this line. And we can see that sure enough, that plane is on the same plane as this here. And it's at 0. It's in the same direction as this cylinder. And I can start to rotate. I can either dynamically drag or type it in. So I'm going to say -25 in this case. Okay. And now I can sketch on this face. Notice the direction, so we're looking straight on that plane. I can come in and create my circle. Let's do 20. Stop my sketch. Say extrude. Again, I'll say to object. And we can see, sure enough, it extruded at a, I think I said 20 degrees angle to the object. Okay. Now here's the interesting thing. You'll notice my line is right here. If I wanted the top of my cylinder to be in line with this guy here, I would have had to draw on my circle so the top of it was right there. Let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to undo. Say create a 2-point circle. And I'll do something like this. I'll just say 20. Stop my sketch. And now you can see that this is in line right here. If I were to extrude, I'll say to object. And we get that result there. Okay? But the key thing here, as I was trying to show, is to create this boss at an angle, we actually had to create an axis, basically. In this case, we just drew a line. And then use that line to create a plane at an angle. So there will be some situations where you might need to use 2 or 3 of these to get the result that you want. Okay? I'm going to put that circle back. Oops. Let me go right here. And let's say 20. And I'll extrude this. Now here's a neat little thing I'm going to show in just a second. I'm going to say to all, whoops, to object. Okay, I now have this shape, but I want it to be a hollow pipe. So I'm going to select this top face, right mouse click, and it shows me the commands that make sense. I'm going to say shell, and I'm going to shell through all of these faces, like so. Let's just do maybe a 3mm wall thickness. I'll say OK, and we're now looking through that. So I started with basic primitives such as cylinders, and then used the shell command to create these wall thicknesses. And now I can come in, maybe add a 3mm fillet around these edges here, like so, and say OK. Now, let's say we decide we want to move this guy somewhere else. So I can come in here and say move, and I'm going to move some sketch objects. I'm just going to draw a box around all of that and tell it I want to rotate around an axis. And as I start to do this, I can say, okay, let's rotate that 45 degrees. I'll say okay, and I got a weird result. I must have selected something more than I needed to. Sorry about that. Let me try it with the top one. Let me do that again. Move, sketch objects. It should work. Make sure yeah, let's try that. And tell it to rotate. And it's there it goes. Yeah, I must have selected something extra when I did the bottom one. But all I did was basically drew a box around this. Now I could have said move faces, move features, but I just said move the sketch around, and of course this has to update accordingly. So, okay, so with that, I'm going to check the chat really quick. I noticed a lot of people were sending chat, so bear with me. I'm going to glance and see if I can answer anybody's questions. I really do appreciate all your comments and questions, and I always run out of time at the end. I notice I have a few minutes left here before the top of the hour, so I'm going to see if I can answer any of these for you. Okay, lots of people saying thank you. Okay, so how can we draw lines on a round surface? So you don't really draw lines on a round surface. You can actually project. So for example, if I created a sketch here, I can then draw a particular shape like so, okay? And it's going to be out here on a plane. Let me do another sketch. It's been a while since I've done this. I'm going to say project to surface. Okay. Project sketch geometry, edges or vertexes to a selected face. So I'm going to say project to a surface. So what's the face? I'm going to say this is the face. What's the curve? I'm going to say that's the curve. And now you can kind of see if I rotate around a little bit how it's actually taking this particular shape and projecting it onto a curved surface. So it's kind of a two-step process where you create your profile on a regular plane and then you project it onto the surface. And I think if I were to change this, let me see if I can move that. I think it'll update the projection if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, there. So you can see how it updated the projection. So if I came in here and said move that down a little bit, watch what happens to this point when I say OK. You'll see how it moved down. So, and that is projected on that curved surface. So great question. So that was from Ekram. Let's see. Let me get, where's my mouse? Okay. Lots of comments in here. I'm just trying to get caught up. Do the intersection points of axis lines and faces create a point that can be used as references for additional planes or axes? I showed that earlier. If I were to say, for example, so that's a really good question. If I were to come in and say axis, let's just say axis perpendicular at point, and I just click right there, I'm going to go ahead and extend this open. So it's cutting through my cylinder, but there is not a point. And I think this is what the question, this is from, I'm not going to say the name correctly, Ayal, I'm guessing. But there's not a point right there for me to select. However, I could come in here and say, for example, let's just do a tangent plane, and I'll say OK. Then I can create a sketch on that plane, and we could project that axis. So if I were to click on this axis, you'll see that it's actually going to project that. This sketch is getting kind of confusing here. onto here, okay? And now I have some points. Now the reason there's a line here is because my axis is going in a slightly different direction than my plane was, but I now have a point or an edge I could catch to. That was a really quick example. Probably should have slowed down. Okay, so let's do, because I want it to be along that axis, so I'm going to say plane along a path. So I could specify, oh, I guess it won't let me do it on an axis. Darn it. That's a good question. I might have to take this one offline. I thought I could put a plane at an angle. That's going to go the wrong direction. But actually I could create a sketch and then project this whole cylinder right here. And it will create points on the edge, like so. So if I were to connect those dots, I don't know if this is the right solution here, but I now have a point right there. So yeah, that's a good question. I will take that one offline, because yeah, it'd be nice to be able to click right there. So let me see if there's any other questions. Okay, good. Let me see. Somebody asked, why would you need to change the size of a plane? I showed that example. That looks like about it. So with that, I want to thank everybody once again for attending. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave comments on future topics that you want to see. I am adding them to my list. I know some people have said they want to see sculpting and surfacing and cam and all those things. I'm absolutely going to be doing those in the near future. So definitely add to the comments on what you'd like to see, and hope to see you on a future live stream. Thank you.